Before I became a writer, it was my dream to become a game designer. I even worked on a small Dutch game called Age of Wonders 3 during an internship. But this dream of becoming a game designer was fueled by the Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. If you want to know more about how that game inspired me to start writing, I suggest you check out our intro episode. So, last year I played Age of Calamity and I started to think, isn't it time for a Zelda MMO?
So, I like this idea because I know that Zelda is already opening up what a Zelda game can be with Breath of the Wild and being an open world, but there's a lot of online games, but how would you see this as an MMO?
So yeah, why Age of Calamity inspired me is because it's the first time, well, it's not really the first time you play as a different character than Link. In Majora's Mask you played as Kafei, which is the most known side character, I think. But you also play as the Deku Butler's son, Darmani, Mikau. But in Age of Calamity you had a really wide variety of characters, which were the Gerudo, you had Gorons, you had Zoras, Rito, you even played as Yiga, Sheikah, so all the races. And I thought, in my opinion, it would be really cool if you could create your own Zelda character. For example, a Hyrulian or a Sheikah or Goron, Zora, Rito, Gerudo, and perhaps even Yiga. And all these different races have different skill sets. And I just think it would be really cool to create a Goron with a massive Daruk beard and maybe a little volcano on top of his head.
What I know from, for instance, Destiny, which I had some experience with, you need certain skill classes to fix certain puzzles during raids. That could also probably then likely be an element within this game where certain skill classes are needed to solve certain puzzles.
Zelda has these sort of puzzle box dungeons, and in my opinion it would be really great if you could explore them. And these are all elements in different Zelda games, but I think combining them would make a great Zelda game. For example, having really big switches on the ground, which was in Majora's Mask. You would need to be a Goron to press the button, or otherwise you would just too light. So Gorons are really heavy, and as a Goron you can push really big blocks. Or Goron Pound, in which you slam into the ground and press a button that way. Or for example, if you're a Rito, how cool would it be if you play the same dungeon, you would go to the upper levels of the dungeon and fly between certain rooms, instead of when you're, for example, a Goron, you're more on the ground. Or if you're a Zora, all the gameplay elements would be in the water. I think it would be even cooler if you could just go into a dungeon with friends.
Like a raid?
Yeah, like a raid, and you would need all these classes or races to each explore a different part of the dungeon and maybe press a switch to open the door to the big boss.
I like that idea. Personally, I thought that one of the strongest things about Destiny is the community aspect of it. Is that you play this together and you need to play this together. And I believe that even in Zelda, because I played 4 Swords in the past, it had an element where you could play this as a multiplayer and people could solve puzzles together. I think that solving puzzles together would be a very engaging way of doing that, and especially if you have an MMO, you're gonna have seasons, so you're gonna have new puzzles. At some point you're not gonna be done with the puzzles, so that's gonna be exciting, I think.
One thing I didn't mention is Zelda is a single player game, so introducing Sheikah technology, so you could do a dungeon with friends, but you could also do it on your own. So having, for example, Sheikah technology, which was also in Age of Calamity, the Sheikah could split herself in multiple...
Yeah, in 4 versions of themselves, I believe in the 4 Swords at least.
Yeah, exactly. So what you could do is split yourself up, do one part of the dungeon, split yourself up, do the second part. Everybody, I think, should have the same skill, but unlocked at a different part of the game. So, for example, when you're a Goron, you're very heavy, but if you're a Hylian, yeah, you're just this skinny person, and you could unlock a certain technology at a certain point in which you could lift heavy objects and just push a switch with that instead of using your own weight. Or breathing underwater. As a Zora, you can do it immediately. If you're a Hylian, you have to unlock the skill.
And maybe you could also have this part where other races can help you out crossing that path.
Yeah, but like I said, dungeons should be optional to play either alone or with friends.
Would dungeons always be for a big boss, or would it also be for loot?
When I play a MMO, I just like the loot. It gives you a sense of progression. But the thing that Destiny did wrong, in my opinion, is I wanted to play the game with you, but you weren't as skilled.
Yeah, I'm a very casual gamer.
And I think that's also the philosophy of Nintendo. A game should be playable by everyone. And if you're not skillful enough and get locked out of certain parts of the game, that's not a fun experience.
How do you see this evolve in the story?
For a story, I think also inspired by Age of Calamity, I think a Hyrulian civil war could be a great way to... Well, it's not really a story, but that setting would be cool. And you could have something like in Twilight Princess, you could be part of the resistance, so you don't play as Link, but you could fight alongside Link to do certain quests. Or for example, how could the map change per season? And it doesn't have to be seasonal, but it could also be every day. There's, for example, a raid of moblins and bokoblins which attack Kakariko village, and there's this timed event that everybody in the area needs to gather there and defeat these monsters before the city gets turned into a monster stronghold. And for example, Ganon spreads all his malice across Hyrule, and you as a player or in a joint effort with other players have to get rid of the malice. Those could be parts of a story, and how you could defeat the malice is by completing a dungeon, the traditional Zelda way. For a story, you could go back to Ocarina of Time, in which Ganon, or Ganondorf, Ganon's human form, was a...
He was the advisor for the king, basically.
Yeah, so that could be his part in an MMO. And he could have his henchmen all throughout Hyrule. And you have to basically defeat them one by one before you get to Ganon. So it would enrich a Zelda story with more political stuff.
And what I also like about this is that, but I can only imagine that there can also be factions, and that throughout the story you might have chosen a certain class, and that class is in alliance with this and this and this team. And that's how the story starts, and you can start it from one perspective or another perspective, and you can have life paths in that sense. And it could even be kind of Game of Thrones inspired, where there's a enemy in the further distance that people aren't focusing on because they're focusing on their own battles, and then all of a sudden everyone has to unite at some point for like a big Vati coming in, or like a Ganon coming in, or we have to protect the whole country against like a blight. So I can imagine that especially in the beginning, you can start with the idea of just having that civil war, kind of making that the story, and then at the end of the season it could be this big, almost MCU kind of fight where you have to fight this big bad. Because I can imagine that you can play this along multiple seasons, which is a very MMO thing.
Yeah. It's also in Age of Calamity, in which all races fight together for saving Hyrule. Hyrule is overrun by mostly bokoblins and moblins.
How big would you make this game? Because you're already talking about multiple races, so these could be multiple life paths, so they wouldn't all need their own beginning point, but then you also need places that are the unknown. If we're talking about the hero's journey, you go into the dark side of the world and you explore things and you come back like a richer person. So there's gotta be a lot of space. Like, how big is this gonna be?
If it was up to me, the map of World of Warcraft is a really great example, in my opinion, which is divided in all these smaller parts. But for a Zelda game, I think each race would get a map the size of the Breath of the Wild map. So it would probably be expanded by 5 or 6 times.
Well, a man can dream. But I can only imagine that these big feats and building these big maps that have to also feel not as empty, like GTA 5 had, for instance, with like a very big wasteland that just feels very empty. I mean, you obviously don't want to have that. You don't want to have an MMO where you're walking for an hour and you haven't seen anything.
I partially agree with the map. Breath of the Wild was inspired by Red Dead Redemption 2, if I recall correctly. So Red Dead Redemption 2 does have these big parts of no man's land. You should not have empty parts for for more than 1 minute. But I believe, generally speaking, when you play a game, each 30 seconds there has to be something new or people lose interest. And Red Dead Redemption, I believe, stretched it to 1 or 2 minutes. And Zelda could do this well, I believe. But so, yeah, there could be stretches of land where nothing happens.
Of course. What I would like to add to that, though, is what I think is one of the reasons why it worked in Red Dead Redemption 2, is because you would have that anticipation of there would always be a very spontaneous event happening around the corner. Things that and I think The Witcher did this as well.
Breath of the Wild does it too.
That's good to know. So it is something that people already expect a little bit of Zelda. Talking about other games that are doing this, I know Final Fantasy XIV has been doing this for 12 years, and in the beginning had like a very rocky start, but perfected it along the way. How long do you see this going? Like, what is the lifespan of this type of thing?
I think the best example is World of Warcraft. It's almost 20 years and still going strong.
Well, World of Warcraft is PC, right? So you can upgrade a PC. You don't need to buy a new PC. But how would you do that on console?
The thing is, Zelda doesn't have a photorealistic graphics engine.
True.
So your graphics will never be outdated. There are people that are still playing Breath of the Wild 6 years later, and Breath of the Wild isn't even a MMO, and they're still discovering new things.
You can upgrade these things, of course, for new consoles as well.
Yeah, and like Destiny did with the seasonal content, have each season have a new raid.
Yeah.
They can keep adding new dungeons or renewing the world.
I can only imagine this is going to be Nintendo exclusive.
Yeah, I don't think Zelda would be on a PlayStation or an Xbox. But that's also the thing. Nintendo doesn't have any MMOs in general. Yeah, you can play Mario Kart online, but that's not the same as playing, for example, Destiny or World of Warcraft or Guild Wars or you name it.
I think, especially with the Switch, I think that there's never been a better time because you can play the Switch wherever you want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's why I think Zelda is great for an MMO formula. But that's my opinion.
I like this idea, and I like this format as well, where you kind of pitch this idea, and we kind of think about how could you develop this concept into a format.
Yeah, so I would like to end this episode with Shigeru Miyamoto-san or Eiji Onuma-san. If you need any help, just call me.
Now, do you think a Zelda MMO would work? And what would you like to see in the next entry to the franchise? Reach out in the comments and join the discussion.
And if you like this idea, you might also like my latest short story, which has nothing to do with Zelda, but it's just a nice story. You can find it on talesofestus.com. You can find a link in the description.
And if you enjoyed the video, consider liking it and perhaps even subscribing, as this would greatly help us grow the channel. And as usual, thank you for listening, and see you in the next one.